Episode 71, Thar She Blows, the rise of the 18th century oil industry. Hello and welcome to the History of American Food. This week I'll be looking at what whaling looked like and how it worked in the 18th century colonies. Before there was fancy 21st century Nantucket, there was whaling Nantucket. But a lot of things had to happen for whaling Nantucket to happen. And that is what we're going to look at this time. We already know the colonists arrived without a taste for whale meat, but did that change once they hit their new shores? Or did whale mostly remain in the energy and equipment column? So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that for nearly all of the time humans and whales have been interacting, it has been as food. People are mostly not eaten by whales, but I'm not going to say never since I have seen orcas hunt a seal. But that's only toothed whales. Humans would never be eaten by baleen whales, and that is, mostly all the really big ones, because they only eat krill. That's a kind of tiny shrimp that feasts on plankton. You know, those science fiction-y array of microscopic plants and animals, which itself is the largest set of living biomass in the oceans. I'll get some links to cool pictures in the show notes, or you can just look up something like the Okino blog. We've established that it's people that have been eating whales. It looks like people started with the smaller cetaceans, dolphins and porpoises, and then worked their way up to large whales. And of course, not turning up their noses at the bounty of the odd beached whale. But that's been all pretty well covered last episode. Now it's time to talk about the 18th century and the colonists and how they interacted with whales. The 18th century was a boom time in wooden boat architecture innovation. With the claiming of the bountiful and apparently endless forests of New England, the dreams of any naval architect were expanded and surpassed. If tens of thousands of mast-worthy white pines could be used for other stuff and still allow enough for Britannia to rule the waves, the sheer volume of trees must have been staggering. So boats were built for cod fishing, for hauling soap ashes and barrel staves, for hauling human captives and molasses, sugar, rum, and cotton and spices, and the riches of the developing China trade and all the emerging luxuries of this age when ideas and industry flowered. Pirates had cash to spare and might have ships made or altered to run and fight, and generally make life difficult for the multi-decked monster gunships that were being constructed for the expanding British Navy. There are many great historical fictions of this 18th and 19th century world, and from my late 20th century view, the two ends of the genre seem to lie in the Everything is Awesome Horatio Hornblower saga by C.S. Forester, and then the somewhat grittier but still life is pretty awesome in Patrick O'Brian's Jack Aubrey books, with, of course, many more stories in between and on the fringes. And because of where we are looking this week, boats were also being built to continue and expand the industry of the Basques, the pursuit of the whales of the Atlantic. Last episode, I definitely hand-waved over the development of the Basque boat technology advancements. With a little more time to consider and, of course, read up on the topic, I have more to add. And guess who's back? Yep, our man at the center of the launch of the age of European exploration, Prince Henry the Navigator. Basque whaling had been going on for hundreds of years by the time our restless prince got involved with funding technology startups in boat hull, compass, astrolabe, and sail-shaped spaces. Check out a map. Basque Country, more or less, and from time to time, has sat upon large chunks of the rim of the Bay of Biscay. Yes, this is going to be a map episode, and just look where Portugal is, facing out to the Atlantic, hanging under the Bay of Biscay, the home of that ever outward-reaching fishing nation, the Basques. Of the Europeans, it really was first the Basques, and then the Portuguese who saw the world's oceans as a road rather than a barrier. While Basque names dot whaling histories of Europe, they are also to be found in the captains and boatwrights who helped build the 15th century Portuguese engine of exploration that began the exploitation of Africa for gold, superior iron, ivory, and humans, and then would expand to India for spices, and China and the Far East for silk and porcelain, and finally to Brazil for land to expand sugar from a luxury to a globe-spanning and history-altering industry. One material that was essential for all this technological boom was the increase in availability of artificial light. Not only were the Basques and the growing Bay of Biscay whaling industry selling to the church, they were also selling to all the royal, noble, banking, and merchant houses of Europe. Along with the boat tech boom, the Portuguese workshops would also be using the most sophisticated lamp oil of the age. And not just the oil, the baleen, the plastic of the pre-petroleum age, known then as whalebone, would have also been used in 1,001 ways. This material of great spring and sturdiness could perform tasks that were otherwise unknown in a world of hemp, wool, leather, wood, and brass. A strange hole in the explorer's toolbox was the general lack of preserved whale meat. It seems odd that the barrels of salt beef and salt pork and salt, horse, donkey, mutton that were being sent to sea with these new long-distance travelers did not include whale meat. And put a hook on your American food framework to hang the idea of travel food from, because this is going to be a recurring theme. America is going to take many tries to get any good at this, both when it comes to travel for expanding the country and in all the wars. Over time, as whale kills shifted from a whole society event, where nearly every part of the whale was turned into something useful, to a market event, where only the most profitable parts of the whale were collected and the rest of these enormous entities were generally being given away or discarded, whale meat lost its status. In the literature of the time, it became what people in poor fishing villages ate because they could not afford pork and beef. It became either a momentary delicacy or a strange dinner to be survived by whalemen at sea. And it still appeared on the rich man's tables as a way to show off a new pie or some other rare culinary curiosity. But as the meat generally lost status, the oil gained. It had space in the fancy quarters of a ship as something to read by and even cook with at sea, and not just to fry up whale oil donuts. If you remember in the sea pie saga of episode 57, I introduced the idea of captain's food versus sailor food. So in the end, except for possibly an eccentric ship's master, the whale meat itself might be food for a hungry jack-tar, but never was normal food to be included regularly alongside beef and mutton and pork on the captain's table, at least not in ways they were willing to regularly write home about. And this overlooking of whale meat as a regular part of mealtime seems to have traveled with the spread of the whale oil harvesting industry. For as going to sea for war and profit became firmly entrenched in Europe in the 16th century with stunts like Spain's invincible Armada, so did going to sea to harvest the briny deep for light. It's not that the older light sources were lost, it's just that by the 17th century they were old, not as nice, not quite modern, and not so scientific. Tallow candles from the waste fats of beef and pork weren't going to go away, but they were relatively cheap, burned a bit unreliably, dripped in embarrassing ways if one was holding an event of note, and might smell somewhat of dinner gone off a bit. After all, tallow candles were a byproduct of the growing salt beef and salt pork industries and had eager buyers and users on each side of the Atlantic. But because they could be made sort of by anyone and purchased as a side product of another industry, tallow candles shifted from being a sort of everyday candle for all that needed light to the cheap candle of the lower class. Beeswax, of course, would not go away, either then or now. The high-quality, steady light and generally pleasant or neutral smell of beeswax light would keep it around. Even now, it's considered a reasonable way to store light for non-electricity periods. And of all the ways of making a light source where burning is involved, it's the sort of thing even us modern people, who are so stinky and gross things averse, will take up. Harvesting honey and the associated wax can be extremely sticky work, but compared to rendering animal fats or fractioning petroleum products, it seems so gentle and reasonable. Heck, it even cleans up with regular soap and water, and no part of the leavings are generally considered hazardous waste. But as we established last time, it is and was an expensive material in terms of time and effort, so would continue to be reserved for the wealthy and special occasions. But whale oil, this newest stuff, the best stuff, the insert, the new amazing thing here that will solve all of our problems and make our dreams come true, thing of its day. Oh, and an odd little tidbit, whale oil at this point was also known as train oil, which made no sense to me because, well, there were no trains, no locomotives at this point. But But as the centuries turned from the 17th to the 18th, the muddle-along English were largely being pushed out of the whaling-for-profit game by the better organized Dutch. And the Dutch word for whale oil, train, or the drops or tears from valvenspek, from whale bacon, snuck into the English way of referring to oil, which is why we have references to train oil before we have trains. And this oil was favored for lots of reasons. The oil from both toothed and baleen whales would stay liquid or at least fluid at the low temperatures suffered by the residents in chilly monasteries, northern watchtowers, and the emerging network of exposed coastal lighthouses. The spermaceti candles of the highest quality were preferred over tallow certainly, but were even better than beeswax in the warmer climates of the expanding British Empire. In the tropics, tallow would drip and stink, but even classy beeswax would droop, which lowered its candle efficiency. But the spermaceti candle could be depended upon to perform in London or Sydney, Australia, or in provincial India in the same way, until paraffin was formulated in the 1830s and then made cheap in the early 20th century. The candle from the wax of a sperm whale's cranial bulb was the ultimate source of artificial light. Wait, you say, so people were mostly burning whale products, not eating them? So why are we here? Because in order to harvest these whale products, the way food was shipped and produced was bent by the whaling industry and the shipping industry generally of the 18th century. The rise of global colonization and global warring were driving the development of more food that was more shelf-stable. And there was a buildup of food preparation for military purposes not seen since the Roman and Persian empires. The barrels of salted and smoked meats, the biscuit, dried fish, dried fruits, hard cheeses, casks of spirits and syrups and oils, the need to blockade ports, to chase pirates, to be pirates, to ship goods like sugar and coffee and ginger and pepper and porcelain from one side of the globe to another was creating a new food market and new food products. And one of the very profitable ventures that supported this rush to develop food suitable for months at sea, beyond land conquests, were the riches to be gained from whales. The growing availability of all this artificial light and seemingly miraculous lubrication material for the newly invented metal machinery both allowed late-night discussions to happen, plus, of course, caffeine and tobacco and sugar, while also facilitating innovations in metal to manufacture things. All of these things, the desire for manufactured food, more stable food that lasts, and arrives in ready or readier-to-eat forms, will all lead to the building of entirely new food production and distribution systems. And as invention follows upon invention, the increasing availability of whale oil, spermaceti, and the rendered whale blubber will mean the innovative food manufacturing sector will soon find ways to add whale products to our food. But before things get too crazy, in the late 19th and early 20th century, that's when all the burgeoning creativity explodes into American food innovation, we need to slow down and look at the state of 18th century North American colonial whaling, how it worked, and how it shaped the food scene. 18th century colonial whaling was shaped profoundly by 17th century European whaling. Last episode, I did a quick run-through of global whaling, and it was global, and how, all in all, it was pretty similar from location to location. In traditional existence hunting, there just aren't that many different ways people with hand tools can tackle something as large as a whale. Details like boat construction, nets or no nets, and the shape or material of the spear or harpoon used may differ, but essentially the hunt with many small boats chasing whales ran the same way. And this is where things stood in the 17th century. There was a skill of how and where to place the harpoons. Strength and experience were a plus. And in the 17th century, as the English and Dutch and French all began to pursue whales in earnest, wanting more than the occasional beach bonanza, they tended to hire Basque harpooners to lead hunts and train home talent. And since the whales of the Bay of Biscay were all eaten up, many a skilled Basque whaler was happy to go earn a living elsewhere. Some took part in the dwindling Basque overseas whaling ventures in Iceland and Ireland and Greenland, Brazil, Terra Nova, and likely elsewhere. For good fishermen of the age, just as with the Basque codmen, had little interest in sharing all their good spots. But building and running pan-oceanic boat ventures and oil marketing was an awful lot of work. and there was no Basque port that was the center of lively global trade, at least not on the scale of Amsterdam, London, or La Rochelle. So many a harpooner hired out to livelier European ports for a wage rather than carrying all the risk of running an entire operation. But at the end of the 17th century, even the presence of the Basque whaler on foreign ships was dwindling, and by the 18th century, the Basque whaling man was essentially gone, except as legend. The earliest harpooners and whaling captains of the colonies, largely setting out from the coast of Massachusetts, were English whalers in search of new fishing grounds. Soon enough, these Englishmen and some Dutchmen, they were training colonial-born watermen in the trade. As a result, the dreams of the Pilgrims to capture and cash in on the whales visible from the island of Nantucket and that funny elbow of Cape Cod were finally going to be made flesh. European whaling leading up to the North American and New England development had been, in the big picture of emerging industries, a rarish event. No port was a particular hotbed of whaling activity. The landing of a whale was still a bit of a momentous event. Paintings would be made, engravings would be done. Tens of whales a year was typical, occasionally topping 100. As I established in the last episode, this was no small feat and provided, for the time, society-changing volumes of artificial light. And there were still beaching events, singular or as groups, that could be exploited for cash. Overall, people were making reasonably good money in the trade, but no city was really a center of global whaling. That was all about to change. The low-lying island of Nantucket and Cape Cod both have excellent views and good water access to the stretch of water of the Atlantic to the southeast known as George's Bank. This area was already established as excellent cod fishing grounds, but it also was literally swimming with whales. At the start of the 18th century, shore whaling was the method of choice. With masts driven into the hills above the beaches where the whaling boats were kept, boys and elderly former whalers would sit upon these masts in shifts from sunup to sundown, seeking whale sign. At the sight of a spout from a whale pod, a version of the famous call, "Thar she blows," would go out. Rowboats with 6 to 10 oars would be launched with a harpooner at the front guiding the boats after their prey. The crews of these boats were a mixed lot. Native Americans, Africans, both freed and enslaved, along with Englishmen, and a mix of other Europeans crewed the boats. Truly, the only requirement was a strong back and an ability to row in time with the rest of the boat. However, due to the entrenched traditions of English law, the boats and the associated trying works were invariably owned by a European or English man. This usually had to do with the fact that these men could bank and sign contracts. To use the language of the laws and slave codes of the era, the savage, the Negro, or the men of the black and red races were nearly always excluded from the participation in lawful contracts. From place to place and time to time, free blacks might own land or boats, but such rights and property were frequently removed on a caprice of ruling colonial officials. And of course, the native inhabitants of Massachusetts were always excluded from ownership. This, of course, is the pattern that will be repeated as the food industry develops with the new country. And so, the practice of shore whaling was set up in New England. The industry that started in the Bay of Biscay and began to light up Europe at night became more concentrated, more specialized, and more profitable in its new home in New England. The whales were seasonal, and their processing took up space and was, frankly, quite stinky. So, over time, whaling stations with masts or lookout towers on shore and the cooking furnaces where valuable fat was separated from valueless meat and baleen was collected sprang up in a dotted line along the east coast as other colonial whaling stations were set up, away from the cities. Nantucket, Cape Cod, and then New Bedford all became centers of whale processing and oil shipping. Soon they were joined by Rhode Island and stations around the mouth of the Delaware River. The outer shore of the spit encompassing the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia would also host spotters, with whales being brought into the bay for processing. Eventually, the Outer Banks of North Carolina, the same sandbar-riddled islands that hindered most merchant trade for the colony, would also host a few whaling camps. All of these places provided a spot for whalers who had been pushed out of the crowded market up north to work. The whaling camps in these further locations each had their set of problems. The North Carolina outer islands had to import food for the workers and firewood for oil trying, which cut into their profits. And then once the oil had been barreled, it still had to be hauled to a marketplace like Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, up north to Philadelphia, Boston, or New York, or out to one of the big sugar islands like Barbados, Jamaica, or Saint-Domingue. All of this shipping stuff in and shipping stuff out definitely cut the profits, and the further out stations tended to only catch 5 or up to a high of 10 whales in a given season. While the North Carolina stations were difficult to operate due to their distance from supplies and markets, the Chesapeake whaling stations were haunted by different problems. Whaling stations in places like Newport, at the mouth of the Delaware and North Carolina's Outer Banks, and way out at the end of Massachusetts all had good water circulation. But the eastern edge of the Chesapeake had comparatively limited water flow. As a result, the blood and discarded whale parts began to noticeably foul the bay. The stench and floating refuse were so objectionable that the office of the governor of Virginia colony had to make rules about who could engage in whaling and where and when it could be done. I didn't find the specific reports of exactly how awful things got, but the fact that there are letters of complaint and a rule was made shows that this was a problem. The sorts of whales hunted at this time were limited. Sperm whales were the most challenging, but also the most prized. The waxy spermaceti, of course, was the most desired material. But like the right whales, sperm whales also had blubber that could be refined to make the regular whale oil that was also pretty darn valuable. And along with their oil, right whales, as baleen whales, they produced both oil and what was known as whalebone. But due to the nature of whaling at this time, shore-based, where the whalers started from shore, rowed out to a whale, and then brought the kill back to shore for processing, whether it was a sperm whale or a right whale, or the smaller and less desirable pilot whales, they had a few important properties in common. They were comparatively slow. A boat rowed by humans could usually catch them. They weren't too big, generally under 100 tons, so they could be beached and dismantled by fewer than 30 men. And most importantly, when dead, they all floated. This will not be a common property of all whales, as we will see later, but it was essential to all the early whaling practices, whether for existence hunting or for the early industry. If these whales had sunk, they would have pulled all the hunting boats to the bottom with them, making all the effort to catch them worse than useless. Through the 16th century, most of the baleen used had been fairly utilitarian, focused on tools and equipment. By the 17th and 18th century, the baleen started to show up in more places, not just as buckets and nets and shipboard equipment. Its durable, springy nature lent it to all sorts of fashionable uses. Strips of these baleen plates would be made into the leaf springs that gave carriages some of their bounce. They also appeared as snappy buggy whips, as umbrella ribs, as hat brims, and became indispensable to women's fashion. The structural wear that women wore as support garments in the 16th century were known as a pair of bodies. The most famous visual example is the uniquely long torso Queen Elizabeth I would give herself. During the 17th century, the pairs of bodies would transform into stays. These structural garments gave shape to dresses and support to women's anatomy as they went through all the labor of keeping up a household. The elaborateness of the stays depended on a woman's station. Was she a cottager making do with only her children and a servant or maid or two? Or the head of a large household, or a poor relation, or a servant or an enslaved person herself? Each sort of woman would have stays, just how elaborate depended. As you can imagine, the stays a servant or slave had to lace upon herself would be different from those worn by a woman who was dressed by her sister and then did turnabout duty, and then different yet to the stays worn by a woman who was dressed by a dedicated lady's maid. By the 18th century, stays were becoming more elaborate and starting to take on some of the characteristics that would become associated with the word corset, though that word wouldn't come into common usage until the middle of the 19th century. As hard as it is to imagine, this was still the age without most items we modern 21st century people would recognize as underwear. But the long linen shifts and shirts I have mentioned before are what did the job. And because stays and the emerging corsets were elaborate and relatively costly items, they would be worn over a linen garment, away from the skin, never ever next to it. That would be ridiculous. As with anything that everybody wears, there were cheaper and more expensive, common and fancier versions of the stiffening in those stays. Cording, reeds, strips of wood, repeated stitching, and multiple layers of tightly woven fabric, sometimes stiffened with flour paste, were all ways the stays were given shape. But the fanciest, the most elaborate, and most fashionable were stiffened with strips of baleen, whalebone. As whaling became more integrated into the emerging colonial economy for light and trade alike, as prices stabilized, as the trade became more regular, the smaller, more remote whaling camps began to fade away. As with nearly all New World foods, things like sugar, cattle raising, and later with dairies and chicken farms, as it became an industry, consolidation occurred and smaller players were pushed out. The loss of the smaller whaling stations was also hastened by the development of whaling ships that would carry the little whaling boats with their crews out to sea, closer to the whales. The blubber would be stripped or flensed off the whales as they floated next to the boats. First, the blubber was cut and stuffed into barrels, and over time, on board, try-works were developed. The growing charcoal market sold to this industry as well, for charcoal was more efficient fuel to carry than bulky plain wood. On the doorstep of the Revolutionary War, Nantucket, the acknowledged capital of 18th century whaling, had 150 offshore whalers, ranging in size from 90 to 180 tons, which equated to ships ranging in length from about 60 to 100 feet or 20 to 30 meters in length. For boat people out there, I know there's so much more to a boat than length, but for the rest of us, we need dimensions other than just tons to get a feel for the size. And these ships would carry anywhere from 2 to 6 whaling boats that would get lowered to go into pursuit of their prey and profits. The arrival of the pelagic or offshore whaler didn't end the catching of whales off the shores of New England, Virginia, and the Carolinas, but rather it meant the end of the whales taken by the men who had to row all the way out from and then all the way back to the shore. Not surprisingly, a few decades of intensive whaling of the east coast of North America will more or less wipe out the whales close to those shores as well, and thus will start the 19th century tradition of globe-circling voyages of multiple years, with wives aboard even. But I'll wait until then to tackle that. The last new custom in whaling that was firmly established in the New World, and not just for whaling, but was becoming the way for lots of food production for the colonies, and then America, was the production of previously unimagined large pools of waste. I mean, don't get me wrong here. Large European cities like London and Paris were fetid pits of waste, human, animal, and burgeoning industrial. The rivers were poisonous, sewers ran down the center of the streets, wells dug in the cities regularly spread disease, refuse piles dotted the yards of city houses, and privies, such as they were, gave a distinctive cough cough tang to the urban air. When people spoke of the dark, dank, disease-infested and dangerous city and the fresh and clean airs of the country, they were pretty correct to say so. Suddenly, the enormous grounds of Buckingham Palace, walled up in the center of modern London, start to make sense. It was the only way their majesties, in pre-treated sewage and running water days of the 18th and 19th centuries, could get a breath of fresh air and still be in the capital. The production of industrial waste had been going on around other food and associated products. That is, after all, the whole story of molasses-produced rum. But with the gargantuan nature of whales, each one producing nearly as much waste as valuable product, made the problem more visible and odoriferous than it had ever been before. Each whale, after the baleen and oil had been removed from its body, along with any of the few choice meat parts, left whaling camp crews with about a half or a third of the original whale's mass to deal with. At over 30 tons, that is more than 60,000 pounds or 30,000 kilos. So the mass of 25 or so automobiles in unwanted flesh and bone suddenly had to be disposed of with each captured and processed whale. We have seen this tendency for waste and the belief in there's always going to be more somewhere manifest itself as the colonists mined forests as they chopped down and milled wood in ways that turned up to 40% of the logs in sawdust, and then choked the fish out of the mill streams. They harvested fox and squirrel and beaver and deer pelts, and at the height of skin harvesting, would simply leave behind most or all of the meat. In Season 1, I talked about the habit of mining the soil, skipping the step of replenishing it with leftover plant compost and working in animal manure, as was common in European fields. For the colonists could just move to more land. When traveling to and establishing homesteads, it was not unknown to cut down entire trees to simply harvest the nut, and soon to shoot entire flocks of birds out of the sky and then leave half of them to rot because it was simply too much work to process them all in a timely manner. This trend will not only become more common, it will happen faster as we roll into the 19th century, and it will not let up in the 20th. For whaling is really the place where the practice of hunting for profit and leaving behind a waste stream really becomes unignorable for the first time in what will become American food. There has always been an association of food and wealth, but for the first time in recorded history, has so much that could be used in plant or animal material been discarded because dealing with the leftovers lacked a profit to make it worthwhile. Yes, I know not all of those beavers that went into making those gentlemen's black top hats were made into beaver stew, and their little sinews were not all made into strings to tie up leather bags or moccasins, but it would take a mighty pile of 50-pound or 20-kilo beavers to replicate the pile of waste flesh produced by one 70-ton whale after its oil and baleen have been stripped away. With the harvest of whales for just 2 or 3 items, and then regularly letting the rest rot on the shore or fall to the bottom of the sea, North America starts a new tradition in the human connection to food, or rather I should say, disconnection. Before the 18th century, there were certainly parts of making animal foods that gave plenty of people queasy stomachs. There were parts of nearly all animals that were yucky to some people. Surely not every kid had fun playing with pig bladder balloons, and there were plenty of people who objected to the taste or texture of cow lungs or sheep kidneys. I mean, neither of those really appeared very often in rich people cookbooks. But up to the end of the 18th century, there generally was not an idea of waste from the harvest of animals. The horns, the bones, the organs, the intestines, the skin, they all had uses. Processes were in place to make use of them. Even if operations like tanning leather or dung collection and composting for fertilizing fields were incredibly low-status jobs no one really wanted, they were occupations that were done. But with the rise of whaling, there was suddenly an industry dedicated to separating the useful part of the whale and creating enormous piles of waste. When I started out on researching the role and place of whales in American food, I had none of this in mind. And weirdly, the realization has nothing to do with the save the whales mood that was in the air when I was a kid in the 1980s. Rather, it was seeing for the first time in my research a huge part of something hunted was being regularly discarded. Up until now, so much effort and danger went into the capture and kill of any animal, even if it was just your own cow. The farmer had put a lot of energy feeding that animal over several winters for the milk and the calves. There was no way the family would simply toss aside half the cow when the milk dried up and they'd cut out all the good steaks. When we get into the 19th century, especially the second half, this new idea about what will then be firmly American food, the idea that food from the same source can be divided into good food and waste, and that there are suddenly mounds of waste associated with the production of food, will become an incredibly American idea that we will do our darndest to spread about the world, and this will last for several hundred years. I like to think we've turned a bit of this corner in the 21st century, but we shall see. For the first time in these British North American colonies, food is shifting from an essential part of society to business, and the light harvested from the whales of the sea is leading the way. Next week, we're back to more regular food. It's pumpkins. And just like last century, they carry a message. With the wider availability of Caribbean sugar and local maple molasses, along with the greater access to spices, that message gets turned all upside down from what it was in the first season. So join me to learn about Pumpkin's second act in the 18th century colonies. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference and help me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. Along with promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter and Insta bio at THOAFood, and you can also find me on post in the same place at THOAFood and in the show description.